They brought me into the inquiry room on a Tuesday, 9 months after the trial ended, and 4 months after the last of us stopped being able to sleep without chemical assistance. The room smelled like recycled air and institutional coffee, and the man across the table from me had the eyes of someone who had already decided what happened and just needed me to confirm it. I told him I would tell him exactly what happened. Whether he would understand it was a different question entirely. My name is Andrew Hale, Sergeant First Class, retired, though the Army stopped using that rank structure about 6 years before I sat down in that chair. I did 2 full deployments during what we now call the adjustment period, that stretch of 18 months between first contact and the signing of the Meridian Accords, when the architects were still deciding how much of us to leave intact. I survived both. I came back with my limbs, my face, and a relationship that had been quietly coming apart since the day I shipped out the first time, though neither Lori nor I had the decency to admit it, until we were sitting across from each other in Dr. Malaka's intake office with paper cups of water and a consent form between us. That was how we ended up in the DTP trial. I should explain what DTP was for the record. The architects, and I use that name because that is what the xenobiologists settled on, not because I have any affection for them, do not communicate the way we do. They do not use sound or light or radio wave. They operate on something the neurologists call structured resonance, a mechanism we still do not fully understand, except that it interfaces directly with the human limbic system and rewrites the emotional context attached to stored memories. They do not erase. They do not implant entirely false recollections. What they do is subtler and, in my experience, considerably more destructive. They take what is actually there, a real event, a real face, a real moment, and they change how it feels. They adjust the weight of it. Fear becomes comfort. Grief becomes indifference. Love becomes suspicion. I want to be precise about what they are, because people who did not serve during the adjustment period tend to describe them in ways that are either too large or too small. Too large, the end of the world, the extinction event, the alien invasion as understood by people who grew up watching alien invasion films. Too small, a political abstraction, a diplomatic problem, the architects as something that happened over there to other people and has since been addressed by treaty. Both of those framings are wrong, and the wrongness matters when you are trying to understand what the DTP trial was actually measuring. The architects are not visible. That is the first thing. During the 18 months of the adjustment period, during 2 combat deployments, I never saw one. Nobody did. The closest thing to a physical manifestation were the relay stations, those geometric structures in the upper mesosphere that appeared over the course of about 72 hours in the second month, silent, not responding to any signal we sent, maintaining their amber and white running lights with the absolute consistency of something that has never needed to consider the possibility of failure. Everything else that happened at the level of neurology, at the level of the interior. They were not interested in our cities or our infrastructure or our capacity for violence. They were interested in our capacity for attachment. The xenobiologist's best working model, which I find credible based on what I experienced in that trial building, is that the architects are a colonial species that acquires territory not by force but by dissolution, not destroying the existing population but separating it from itself, strand by strand, until the network of loyalty and trust and shared meaning that makes a civilization cohere simply stops functioning. And then they wait. They are patient in the way that geological formations are patient, and the result looks from a distance like the civilization collapsed on its own. That was what we were trying to recover from when we walked into Malaka's intake office. Not wounds, not loss. The systematic, technically elegant dismantling of our ability to trust the people we loved. After the Accords, the official position was that the resonance effects had dissipated. The architects had agreed to cease active engagement. The science teams ran their tests and published their reassurances, and the government sponsored rehabilitation programs and told us that what we were experiencing, the fractured relationships, the misplaced anger, the inability to trust our own emotional responses, was ordinary post-conflict trauma, treatable, manageable, human. DTP stood for differential threshold pharmacology. The theory behind it was that certain compounds could selectively suppress the artificial resonance overlays while leaving the authentic emotional substrate intact. In plain English, the drug was supposed to peel back what the architects had done and let you feel the real thing again. Dr. Konstantin Malaka was the trial's lead physician, a careful man, small-framed, with the kind of deliberate stillness that either means deep patience or profound nervousness. I could never decide which applied to him. He explained the risks clearly during the intake session: temporary cognitive disorientation, heightened emotional sensitivity, a phase the documentation called perceptual amplification, during which participants might experience memories with unusual vividness. He said all of this in the same tone a flight attendant uses to describe oxygen masks: informative, practiced, technically honest. He did not say, the drug might strip away not only what the architects installed but the coping mechanisms you have built on top of it. He did not say, if your relationship was already damaged before the resonance interference, you will not be able to tell the difference. He did not say, some of the things you are certain you remember may not have happened the way you remember them, and the drug will make that uncertainty physical: a pressure behind the eyes, a tightness in the chest, the sensation of standing at the edge of something that has no bottom. To be fair, I am not sure he knew any of that yet. There were 3 couples in the trial cohort: Laurie and me, then Christina and Stephen. She was a logistics coordinator for one of the orbital reconstruction firms, and he worked in visual media, long stretches away, which had eaten the trust out of their marriage one unanswered call at a time. And then Bate and Claudia, though Justin, Claudia's brother, was also present in that story in the way that a wound is present even when you cannot see it, a structural damage that does not announce itself until the wrong kind of pressure is applied. Walter ran the monitoring side of the trial. Big man, heavy through the shoulders, with a bureaucrat's vocabulary and a face that gave nothing away. He was not a doctor. His role was oversight, making sure the cameras captured what the documentation required, and that the trial stayed within the parameters that would justify its funding. He sat in the observation room with his binders and his checklists and watched us through screens. I have thought about Walter a great deal in the months since. I have thought about what he saw on those screens and when he saw it, and what he decided to do about it. My first deployment was in the Pacific Rim Coordination Zone during the 8th month. My unit's assignment was population stability, which meant, in practice, watching people and logging what we observed and occasionally intervening when the watching and logging were not sufficient. The resonance effects were already well documented by then. The neurologists had published their initial findings. We knew what we were looking for: sudden increases in domestic incidents, dissolution of community support structures, the particular pattern of social fragmentation that preceded the complete breakdown of a neighborhood or a work unit or a military squad. We knew what we were looking for, and we saw it constantly, and there was very little we could do about it because the mechanism producing it was not something we could shoot. I lost 2 men in my unit during that deployment, not to violence. Lewis, a staff sergeant from the South with a dry sense of humor and 3 children, simply did not come back from leave one morning. He had been present and functional, and then he was not. The official documentation said absence without leave. The unit psychologist said the resonance exposure had been particularly concentrated in his residential block during the 3rd week of the month. I carry both of those facts with equal weight. The second was a corporal I will call Margot, the only person in the unit who could make the communications equipment work reliably, and therefore the person I spent more hours in proximity to than any other during those 8 months. She did not disappear. She stayed. But somewhere around the 5th month she changed in a way that I recognized and could not name until later. The thing that had made her herself, the specific quality of attention she brought to a problem, the refusal to accept incomplete information, the stubbornness that was indistinguishable from integrity, went quiet. She was still present. She still functioned. She had just been made to feel, apparently, that the part of her that cared about functioning well was a liability. I put that in my report. I do not know if anyone read the report. I came home from the second deployment 4 months before the accords were signed. Laurie was at the transport dock. She looked at me for a long moment when I came through the gate, the way you look at something when you are trying to reconcile what you remember with what is in front of you. I did not know, at the time, that she was performing the same calculation about me that I was performing about her. Whether the person she had held in memory during those months bore any meaningful relationship to the one standing in the dock. We drove home in near silence. We had dinner. We were careful with each other in the exhausted, watchful way of people handling something fragile, not certain whether the fragility was in the object or in themselves. 3 years of that. 3 years before Malaka's intake office and the paper cups of water and the consent form, and the small, desperate hope that something chemical could undo what something signal-based had done. We moved into the trial residences on a Sunday, 3 separate units in a single building, instrumented from ceiling to floor, cameras, biometric sensors, air sampling equipment. Malaka came by in the evenings to administer dosage and take readings. The first week was calibration. No active compound, just baseline establishment. Laurie and I unpacked our things and argued about where to put the coffee maker and went to bed in careful silence. And I remember thinking that this was no different from any other week of the last 3 years, which told me something I was not ready to examine. The compound began on day 8. The first effect I noticed was clarity. That is the only word I have for it. I woke up on the morning of day 9, and the anger I usually carried into consciousness with me, that low, constant pressure behind the sternum that I had come to think of as just the way I was now, was quieter. Not gone. Quieter. As though someone had turned a volume knob 2 or 3 increments in the right direction. I lay in bed and looked at the ceiling and felt something I had not felt in a long time, which was the simple fact of being in a room without needing to defend myself against it. Laurie noticed it too, I think. She made coffee that morning and brought me a cup without being asked, and she stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at me for a moment with an expression I had not seen on her face in years. Something open, unguarded. We did not talk about it. We drank our coffee and watched the morning news feed, the usual orbital repair updates and the Accord's compliance reports, and the footage of the relay stations that the architects maintained in the upper mesosphere, those geometric structures that no human hand had built, and that the international bodies had agreed, under the terms of the Accords, not to interfere with. I had stopped being able to look at those relay stations without a specific kind of cold moving through me. That morning, I looked at them and felt nothing in particular, and I understood that the nothing was the drug working, and I was not sure how I felt about that, but I did not say so to Laurie. The second week, the dosage stepped up. By day 12, I was sleeping better than I had in 6 years. Deep, uninterrupted sleep, the kind where you wake up and for a few seconds you do not know where you are because you have been genuinely elsewhere. I dreamed about things before the adjustment period, my parents' house, a fishing trip with my brother, Laurie the first year we were together when she laughed easily and I was still a person who made her laugh. The dreams did not hurt. They just were. I woke from them with a strange, clean grief, the kind that acknowledges loss without requiring you to carry it as a weapon. Laurie and I talked, actually talked, not the tactical exchanges we had been managing, logistics of the day, careful negotiations around the subjects we had agreed not to touch. We talked about the deployment. I told her things I had not told her because I had convinced myself she could not handle them, which had been its own kind of condescension. She told me things she had withheld because she was afraid of how I would use them. We sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning, and by the end of it, something had shifted between us. Some weight redistributed, and I went asleep thinking that the trial was working. I should have paid more attention to the edges. It was Stephen who first described the amplification effect in terms I recognized as something other than therapeutic. He mentioned it in passing during one of the group check-ins Malaka conducted, casual, almost embarrassed, the way men describe things that frighten them. He said that his memories of certain specific conversations with Christina had become very vivid, not pleasant vivid. The kind of vivid where you can feel the temperature of the air and smell what was cooking on the stove, and hear the exact pitch of a voice raised in accusation. He said the memories felt more real than reality, which was an odd thing to say, and Malaka wrote something in his notes and moved to the next item. I logged that and filed it away. On day 16, Lori and I had a fight. It was not the kind of fight we had been having, the controlled exchanges where we both stayed behind our lines and lobbed things we knew would land. It was older than that. It came from somewhere under the management layer, from the reservoir of things I had not known I was still carrying. It was about trust. About whether the version of her I was looking at was the version I had actually fallen in love with, or a version I had constructed to survive the years, when the real one had felt too dangerous to see clearly. She said I had never accepted who she was before me. She was not wrong. I said that every time I thought we had found solid ground, she moved it. I was not wrong about that either. We broke a cup, not thrown, just knocked from the table in the course of a gesture, the kind of accident that happens when two people are occupying a space with too much force. The sound of it shattering was very loud and then very quiet, and we both stood there breathing hard, and Malaka's camera in the corner was recording all of it. Afterward, we sat on opposite sides of the room for a long time without speaking. Then Lori got up and swept the ceramic pieces into her hand and put them in the waste bin, and she came back and sat closer to me than she had been, and I put my arm around her, and we sat like that until the room got dark. I reported the incident to Malaka the next morning. He said it was within expected parameters. He called it a perceptual correction event and wrote something in his binder and told me the intensity would stabilize as the dosage plateaued. Across the hall, Christina had stopped sleeping. I did not know this at the time. I learned it afterward in the debrief documents. What I observed was that she looked different during the group check-ins, thinner through the face, with an alertness in her eyes that had nothing relaxed in it. Stephen looked careful around her, the way you look careful around something that has become unpredictable. I recognized that look. I had worn it myself. What was happening to Christina was this. The drug was not only lifting the architect resonance overlays, it was giving her access to a clarity of recall that her pre-trial anxiety had denied her. She had spent years convinced that Stephen was keeping things from her. Under the amplification effect, every ambiguous memory she owned, every moment he had come home late, every conversation he had cut short, every small inconsistency she had filed and never resolved, was returning to her with a vividness that the anxious brain typically suppresses. She was experiencing, simultaneously, the heightened clarity the drug was designed to provide, and the full, unfiltered archive of a mind that had been trained to catalog grievance. She told Malaka she could see things she had missed before. He recorded this as a positive outcome. He should have asked her what she was seeing. The third couple, Bate and Claudia, I knew less about during the trial itself. Their unit was at the far end of the corridor. Bate was quiet in the check-ins, present but contained, with the particular stillness of someone who has learned to take up as little space as possible. Claudia was warm, genuinely so, and I liked her. She had a quality of direct attention that made you feel like you were being actually heard, which had become rare enough to notice. Justin visited twice that I was aware of, though I only saw him once in the lobby waiting for the elevator. He nodded to me. I nodded back. There was nothing in his face I could read. The thing between Bate and Justin, I only understood after the inquiry documents were released. During the trial, I was occupied with my own situation. I know that is not an excuse. It is just what happened. Day 22 was when the trial began to come apart. It started with the relay stations. I woke at 3 in the morning to a sound I did not recognize. Not loud, more of a tone, subaudible, felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. I lay in bed and my first thought was mechanical, building HVAC, and my second thought arrived about 4 seconds later, and it was not a thought at all. It was a physical sensation, a full-body alertness of the kind that combat experience installs and never fully removes, the kind that means something is wrong before your conscious mind has assembled the evidence. I got up. Lori was already awake, sitting up in bed with her arms around her knees, looking at nothing. I said, "Do you hear that?" She said, "I've been hearing it for an hour." I went to the window. The relay stations were visible on clear nights, geometric shapes against the upper dark, running lights amber and white in patterns that the accords required them to maintain for civilian air safety. They were lit now, but the pattern was different. Not the standard sequence. Something else. Something I did not have a reference point for. I stood at the window for a long time watching those lights. The tone came in pulses. Slow at first, then faster, then slow again, like something settling into a rhythm. I put my hand flat against the glass and felt it there, a vibration that the building was conducting but not producing. My phone showed no alerts, no emergency broadcasts. The network feeds were cycling through their usual overnight content. I got dressed. The hallway was not empty. Christina was standing outside her unit door in a robe, arms crossed, staring at the ceiling. Down the corridor, Claudia's door was open and light was coming through it. We looked at each other, Christina and I saw in her face exactly what I was feeling, which was the recognition that something we had agreed to believe was not over. I said, "How long?" She said, "I couldn't sleep anyway. An hour, maybe more." I walked to Claudia's door and knocked on the frame. She was sitting on the couch with her tablet, running through news feeds with the focused speed of someone looking for something specific. Bate was behind her in the bedroom doorway. Justin, I realized, was not in the unit. He had been visiting, but he was not there now. Malaka's observation room was 2 floors down. I took the stairs. He was there. Of course he was. He was at his monitoring station with Walter standing behind him, both of them watching screens that showed biometric feeds from all 3 units. When I came through the door, they turned, and I saw something cross Walter's face that he controlled too quickly for me to name. I said, "What is happening with the relay stations?" Malaka said, "Mr. Hale, you should be asleep." I said, "Answer the question." He looked at Walter. Walter looked at me for a moment, and then he picked up his tablet and walked to the far side of the room and stood with his back to us, which was its own kind of answer. Malaka told me that the station activity had been flagged, but that it was within recorded variance ranges. He said the monitoring teams at the federal level were aware. He said there was no indication of any breach of Accord's compliance. I asked him what DTP does to the nervous system's sensitivity to structured resonance. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said it increases it, temporarily, as a side effect of the amplification mechanism. I said, "So right now, whatever the relay stations are broadcasting, we are receiving it at higher amplitude than we normally would." He said, "Theoretically, we don't have empirical data on." I said, "What is the drug supposed to do when that happens?" He said, "We don't know. This scenario wasn't modeled." I stood there in that room with its screens and its binders and its careful documentation, and I understood that we had been given a compound that lowered our perceptual threshold at exactly the moment when the entities responsible for restructuring human perception had apparently decided to run a test of their own. I went back upstairs. By morning it was worse. The amplification effect, which I had been experiencing as heightened emotional clarity, as access to an authentic substrate underneath the architect interference, had shifted its character. What I was feeling now was not clarity. It was exposure. The layer that the drug was intended to dissolve was not just the alien overlay. There was something underneath that, something that the resonance broadcast was now reaching, and I did not have language for what it was doing to me except this. I was remembering things I was certain had not happened. Not false memories, something more specific than that. I was remembering moments from the deployments, real events, but from angles I had not occupied. I was inside my own memory but behind someone else's eyes, looking at myself across a room, watching myself give an order and hearing it the way the person receiving the order had heard it. The drug had made the boundary between my perspective and other people's permeable, and the broadcast was using that permeability, pushing through it. And I understood with a clarity that was its own kind of horror exactly what the architects had been doing to us during the adjustment period. They had not been installing false memories. They had been installing false perspectives. Not what happened, how it felt to be there. Not the event but the emotional position from which it was experienced. They had been systematically replacing the first-person experience of every significant emotional event with a third-person one, and the effect was not that we remembered differently. The effect was that we felt differently about the people we loved and trusted, because we were experiencing our memories of them from an emotional vantage point that was not our own. I sat on the floor of the kitchen and thought about 3 years of fighting with Lori about things that had not actually mattered to me, until I had been made to feel that they did. She came and sat beside me on the floor. She did not ask me what was wrong. She had her own version of what was wrong. I could see it in her face. She took my hand and held it, and neither of us said anything for a while. After a time she said, "Do you remember the first year?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Was that real?" I said, "I think so. I think the drug is showing us the difference." She said, "The difference between what was real and what they put in." I said, "Yes." She was quiet, then she said, "I hate them." I said, "I know." She said, "Not for what they did to the world, for what they did to us, for how small it was. All this power, and they spent it making us suspicious of each other." I did not have an answer for that. She was right, and the rightness of it was a specific kind of grief, because what it meant was that the damage had been deliberate and precise, and designed to prevent exactly the kind of conversation we were having now. They had known what would happen if we held on to each other. They had known that was the thing that needed to be dissolved. I heard Christina's voice through the wall. Not words, just the pitch and volume of something breaking. I got up. The door to Christina and Stephen's unit was unlocked. I have thought about this, whether I should have knocked, whether I had the right to walk in, but the sound coming through the wall had the quality of something that could not wait for the courtesy of a knock. Stephen was standing in the center of the room with his hands raised, not in threat, in the gesture of a man who is trying to demonstrate that he is harmless and finding that the demonstration is not working. Christina was at the far side of the room by the window, and she had a look on her face I recognized from the deployments, from people who had been pushed past the boundary where reason operates. The thing with Christina was this: she had not been wrong. I learned this later in the documents. Stephen had been lying to her, not about infidelity. There was no infidelity, but about smaller things, the accumulation of small evasions that couples practice to preserve a comfortable distance, the managed version of yourself that you present to someone you love but do not quite trust with the real one. The drug had given her access to every moment in which she had sensed an evasion, and then suppressed the sensing, dismissed it as her own anxiety. She was now in possession of a complete and vivid inventory of every time she had been right and told herself she was wrong. That is a specific kind of madness, not the alien kind, the human kind, the kind that comes from being a person who is capable of doubt. I put myself in the room between them and I talked. I do not remember exactly what I said. I know I talked about the relay stations and what Malaka had told me and what I thought was happening. I know I told Christina that what she was feeling was real, but that the context had been altered, not by Stephen, not this time by the broadcast, by the same mechanism that had been altering all of our contexts for years. I know she looked at me for a long time with those exhausted, overwound eyes, and then she looked at Stephen, and something in her face changed. She did not forgive him. That came later, slowly, over months, the way real forgiveness moves. What she did was sit down. Stephen sat across from her, and they looked at each other, and I stepped back and went to the door. Claudia was in the hallway. She had heard everything. Her face was very controlled, the way a face gets controlled when it is managing something that could become catastrophic if it is not managed carefully. She said, "Justin called me." I said, "What did he say?" She said, "He said the stations are doing something new. He works in early warning monitoring. Did I tell you that? He said they have been receiving a structured sequence for 3 hours and that nobody at the federal level is responding to the alert requests." I said, "What kind of sequence?" She said, "He said it matches the pattern they recorded during day 3 of the adjustment period, before any of the neurological effects were documented, before anyone knew what they were looking at." We looked at each other. I said, "Before?" She said, "Yes." I understood. Day 3 of the adjustment period had been the seeding event, the initial broadcast that had established the resonance framework in the human nervous system, the first pass, the one that had made everything that followed possible. Whatever the relay stations were transmitting now was not a maintenance signal. It was not a diagnostic. It was a new seeding attempt. And every subject in the DTP trial had a nervous system that the drug had opened like a window. I went back down to the observation room. This time I did not ask Malaka. I walked past him to Walter's station and I stood over it and I said, "You need to take us off the compound. Now." Walter turned from his screen. He had the expression of a man who has been waiting for a confrontation and has prepared for it, which told me that he had known something was coming before any of us had. He said, "The protocol requires a full dosage cycle, termination before plateau creates." I said, "What does a second seeding event do to a nervous system that's been opened up by differential threshold pharmacology?" He said nothing. I said, "Because my read is that it installs cleaner, less resistance. The compound strips the anxiety and the conditioning and the defense mechanisms that developed in response to the first event, and what's left is a nervous system with no filters and no scar tissue, and a relay station broadcasting at full amplitude directly into it." Walter said, "That is one interpretation." I said, "What is yours?" He said, "That the Accords are a framework that requires ongoing compliance monitoring, and that understanding the full operational parameters of the architect communication system is necessary too." I grabbed his collar. "I am not proud of this. I am reporting it accurately for the record." I grabbed his collar and I put him against the wall and I said, "There are 3 couples upstairs who volunteered to have their heads opened up, and you knew this was a possibility and you let them walk in anyway." He said, "The probability modeling indicated." I said, "Look at your screens." He looked. All 3 biometric feeds were showing the same pattern: elevated cortisol, spike in amygdala activation, the specific neurological signature that Malaka's documentation had labeled perceptual amplification, and that I was now understanding was the open window state. All 6 of us were in it simultaneously. I let go of Walter. I said, Cut the dosage, or I will walk upstairs and tell every person in this trial exactly what their nervous system is being used for right now. And then we will all walk out of this building and take our chances on the raw exposure, and you will have nothing." He looked at Malaka. Malaka looked at his binder. Then Malaka got up and went to the medication cabinet and began preparing the reversal protocol. Walter did not stop him. I went upstairs and knocked on every door. What happened over the next 4 hours I will try to describe accurately, because the inquiry documents summarize it in clinical language that does not capture what it was actually like to be in that building. The reversal protocol does not work quickly. The compound has a half-life that Malaka explained to us in technical terms that amounted to: we were going to be in the open window state for several more hours regardless of what he administered. What the reversal compound did was begin the process of rebuilding the filtering mechanisms, which meant that in the interim we were going to feel everything the broadcast was sending with no attenuation and no defense. We gathered in the common area on the 3rd floor, all 6 of us. This was not Malaka's recommendation. It was simply what happened, the way people who are frightened by the same thing move toward each other without being asked. The tone was louder, still below the threshold of normal hearing but physically present, a pressure that moved in waves. I could feel it in my back teeth. I told everyone what I understood about what was happening. I told them about the seating event pattern, about the open window state, about Walter's non-response to the federal alerts. I told them that the reversal compound was in our systems and that we needed to get through the next several hours, and then it would begin to close. Christina said, "What does a new seating do, if it works?" I said, "Based on what the first one did, it resets the emotional context of significant memories. It makes you feel differently about the people in your life. It makes the attachment feel like a threat." Laurie said, "So what do we do?" I said, "I think we hold on to what we know is real, and we do not let it be replaced." This sounds simple stated that way. It was not simple. What the broadcast was doing, and I am describing this from the inside from what it felt like, which is the only data I actually have, was it was finding the places where we were uncertain. It was locating the moments in each of our histories where the truth was ambiguous, where 2 interpretations existed, and it was pressing on those places. Not loudly, not dramatically. With the patient, sustained pressure of something that has done this before and knows exactly where the cracks are. The first hour was the worst. I will try to describe what the broadcast felt like during that hour, because I think it matters for the record, and because nobody who was not in that room experienced it at the amplitude we did. It was not a voice. It was not imagery. It was emotional weather, the only phrase I have found that comes close. Pressure systems moving through, fronts colliding. In the first 20 minutes it operated through grief. I found myself cycling through losses, Lewis, Margot, 2 years of evenings with Laurie that had been spent in managed silence, my brother who I had not called in 4 months because every time I thought about calling him, I felt a preemptive exhaustion that I now understood was not my own feeling. The grief was real. The losses were real. What the broadcast was doing was using them as a delivery mechanism, amplifying the emotional weight until the conclusion it wanted felt like the only logical conclusion, that the connections I had maintained or tried to maintain were the source of the pain rather than the relief from it. The second phase, around 40 minutes in, shifted to anger. Cleaner, simpler, more immediate. I found myself looking at Stephen and thinking things about him that I had no basis for thinking, assembling a case against him from ambient information, the way a mind does when it wants to justify a feeling it has already decided to have. I recognized this. I had seen it in myself often enough during the deployments, in the unit, in the long months with Laurie. I knew what it felt like to be steered by something that was using my own cognitive habits against me. Knowing did not make it easy to resist. It made it marginally easier, which In 4 hours of sustained broadcast was enough. The third phase was the most sophisticated and the one I am least able to describe clinically because it operated on something I do not have adequate language for. It felt like homesickness, not for a place, for a version of myself that had existed before all of this, before the deployments, before the adjustment period, before the years of trying to hold things together with the wrong tools. A self that was simpler, unencumbered. Alone in the clean, specific way of someone who has not yet made the commitments that make loss possible. The broadcast was not threatening that self. It was offering it. Come back to this. Step out of the web. The web is what hurts you. That was the most dangerous phase. Not because the offer was irrational, but because it was genuinely appealing, and the appeal was grounded in something real. The self it was offering was real. It had existed. The broadcast had found it in memory and was holding it up with both hands and saying, "This is still available. The rest of this, Laurie, the trial, the 3 years of damage, the slow work ahead is optional." I looked at Laurie across the room. She was looking back at me. She had her arms around her knees, the same posture she'd had in bed when I had found her listening to the tone 3 hours earlier. She looked tired in the specific way that people look when they have been doing hard interior work for a long time without adequate rest. She looked like herself. The real version, the one the drug had been showing me in glimpses for the past 2 weeks, underneath the years of managed distance and accumulated suspicion. The one who had stood in the kitchen doorway with coffee and looked at me with something unguarded. The broadcast was offering me an exit from everything that had hurt. She was not an exit. She was the thing I was fighting to keep. I looked away from the window of that offer, and I stayed in the room. Claudia, at one point, stood up and said she needed to call Justin. Bates said, "Don't." Claudia turned. There was a look in her face, not cold, something more complicated than cold, the look of a person being pulled in 2 directions with equal force. Bates said, "He is not there right now, Claudia. Whatever you're seeing in his face right now, whatever the broadcast is showing you, that's not what he is. That's what they want you to think he is." Claudia said, "You don't know what I'm seeing." Bates said, "I know what I've been seeing for 3 hours. I know what it's trying to do." They looked at each other. This is the moment I keep returning to in the months since. 2 women, in the middle of a directed neurological assault by entities whose full capabilities we have never mapped, one of them with every reason to let the assault do its work, the other holding her ground not because the ground was easy, but because she had decided what was real and was not going to have it taken. Bates said, "I know what he did. I know it. The drug showed me clearly, and so did the architects before it. But I also know what you are. And they don't get to take you away from me by making me watch you choose him." Claudia sat back down. The broadcast did not stop, but something in the room changed after that, the way a room changes when someone has said the thing that needed to be said, the thing that costs something to say. The 6 of us sat in that common area and we talked, carefully and then less carefully, about the things the drug had shown us before the broadcast had started. The real things. The things underneath the resonance overlays. Laurie talked about her past in a way she had never been able to talk about it with me because I had never been able to simply receive it. And now I could hear it as the thing it was rather than the threat I had been conditioned to experience it as. Stephen told Christina about the evasions, the small ones, the years of managed distance. He named them. He did not explain them or defend them. He just named them. Christina listened. I do not know that this cured anything. I do not know that the conversations we had in those 4 hours solved the problems that 3 years of architect interference had compounded into the problems of the people we had become. But what happened in that room was real. Whatever the broadcast was trying to do to us, it could not get traction in a room where the people in it were looking directly at each other and saying the true thing. That is my working theory anyway. I have had 9 months to sit with it. The architects, based on everything we have documented about them, operate through a specific mechanism. They do not need to create fear. They only need to isolate. They take the fear that already exists, the ordinary, earned, legitimate fears that come from being a person in relationship with other persons, and they use it to build walls. The resonance overlay is not an attack. It is a redirection. Take what is there and turn it inward. Turn it against the connections that would otherwise provide resistance. And the result is a species that defends itself against itself so efficiently that no external force is required. What happened in that common area was the opposite of that mechanism. Not because we were heroes, not because we had some innate superiority that the architects had failed to account for. We were frightened and chemically altered and physically exhausted, and several of us were in the middle of conversations that had been overdue for years. We stayed in that room together because none of us wanted to be alone with what the broadcast was doing to our heads, and staying together required talking, and talking required some degree of honesty, and honesty, the specific, costly, self-implicating kind, the kind where you name the thing about yourself rather than the thing about the other person, turned out to be the one thing the broadcast could not process. It was designed for a mind defending itself. We were not defending. We were open. We had the drug to thank for that much, at least. The tone peaked around 4 in the morning, and then began to subside. The tone peaked around 4 in the morning, and then began to subside. By 6 it was gone. We sat in the gray morning light of the common area, all 6 of us, with empty cups and the particular silence that comes after something that cannot be named precisely has ended. Malaka came up at 7 and ran his readings. He looked at his equipment for a long time without writing anything. In the weeks after the trial formally ended, the official end date, when the monitoring equipment was deinstalled and Malaka completed his final set of readings, and the 3 couples dispersed back to whatever version of their lives awaited them, I did a great deal of thinking about what the broadcast had tried and what it had not managed. I am not a scientist. I cannot give you a technical account. What I can give you is the view from inside, and from inside it looked like this. The broadcast was optimized for the isolated self, for the person in the room alone with their memories, receiving the signal with no external reference point, no one else's face to look at, and use as a counterweight to the version the broadcast was proposing. Every effective component of what I felt during that 4 hours depended, at its base, on my being alone with it. The grief worked when there was no one in the room to grieve with. The anger worked when there was no one to speak the anger to and have it heard as human, rather than as a threat. The homesickness for a simpler self worked when there was no present self in the room doing something worth the complexity. 6 people talking to each other with enough honesty that the talking was actually making contact was apparently a sufficiently strange input that the broadcast could not resolve it into the intended output. The architects, based on everything we have since documented, have absorbed dozens of civilizations. They have run this protocol on species far older, and by some measures, far more sophisticated than we are. They knew where the cracks were. They had found them with precision. What I do not think they had modeled was the specific human tendency to take damage and make it the subject of conversation rather than the reason for silence. We are not a quiet species when we are in pain. I think that turned out to matter. Walter did not come up. I found him in the observation room when I went down for water. He was at his station with the feeds running, logging the night's biometric data with the careful strokes of a man assembling a report. He looked up when I came in. I said, "Was it intentional?" He said, "I don't have the authority to discuss the parameters of." I said, "Was the trial designed to expose participants to a secondary broadcast event in a sensitized state? Yes or no?" He looked at me for a moment, then he looked back at his screen. He said, "The probability modeling indicated that a secondary event was a low-risk scenario." I said, "But you knew it was a scenario." He said, "All scenarios are modeled." I stood there. Outside the narrow window at the top of the observation room wall, the relay stations were catching the early light, those geometric structures hanging in the upper air, with the patience of things that have no concept of urgency because they have all the time they need. I said, "What were you hoping to learn?" He said, whether human neurological resilience under DTP exposure was sufficient to maintain identity coherence during a structured resonance event of secondary magnitude, whether the compound created vulnerability or... He stopped. I said, "Or what?" He said, "Or whether it created something that looked like vulnerability but functioned differently, under operational conditions." I said, "You wanted to know if the open window state could be used the other direction, not just receiving the broadcast, returning something." He did not answer. I left the room. The inquiry concluded that the trial had been conducted outside approved parameters, and that Walter's oversight had failed to meet the standards required by the Institutional Review Board. Malaka received a formal censure. Walter was reassigned. The DTP program was suspended pending review. None of this addressed the question I have been sitting with since that morning. Because here is what I know, 9 months later, after the inquiry and the debriefs and the slow work of rebuilding what the 3 years had damaged. The architects have not responded to the secondary broadcast event in any documented way. There have been no new resonance signatures. The relay stations continue their standard pattern. The compliance teams report nothing anomalous. And I have thought about what Walter said, about the open window state functioning differently than it appeared. Walter was not wrong that we were vulnerable that night. Every conventional metric said so. Elevated cortisol, chemically suppressed defense mechanisms, 6 civilians in an unprotected building with a secondary seeding event running at full amplitude. By every model the Institutional Review Board used to assess trial safety, we were exactly the subjects you do not put in front of a structured resonance broadcast, maximally exposed, minimally filtered. What Walter's probability models had not accounted for was that we were also maximally present. The same compound that had dissolved our defenses had dissolved the managed distance, the performance layer, the version of yourself you maintain under social observation. What the drug had done to us by the night of day 22 was not just open us to the broadcast. It had opened us to each other, and that opening had been in process for 2 weeks slowly, through the fights and the long kitchen table conversations, and the things said out loud for the first time. And by the night of the broadcast we were, in a way I do not have a clinical term for, more genuinely in each other's presence than we had been in years. The broadcast was sophisticated. It found the wounds. It knew the architecture of human attachment, and it knew exactly where the load-bearing elements were and how to induce fracture. But it was designed, I think, for human beings as they normally exist, inside the isolation that the first seeding had carefully maintained, reinforced by 3 years of the emotional distance that isolation produces. It was not designed for what it found in that common area. It was not designed for people who had spent 3 years being pulled apart and were now, on the specific night of a secondary attack, in the process of knitting back together with the help of a drug that made the stitching visible and real. I do not want to overstate what we accomplished. 6 damaged people staying in the same room is not a military victory. We did not defeat anything. We did not reverse the adjustment period or expose a vulnerability in the architect's operational doctrine or produce actionable intelligence for the compliance teams. We held on through 4 hours of directed neurological pressure and came out the other side, and the measure of what that cost us is in the months since. The slow, uneven, frequently frustrating work of learning to trust perceptions that have been tampered with, of distinguishing between the damage that was done to us and the damage we did to each other, of building something real on ground that has been deliberately destabilized. That work is ongoing. It will be ongoing for a long time. I am not under the impression that it ends. In the final hour of the broadcast, somewhere around 3:30 in the morning, with the tone at its highest recorded amplitude, and all 6 of us sitting in that room talking with the honesty of people who have nothing left to protect. I felt something. Not fear, not the cold I associated with the relay stations. Something else. I felt perceived. Not watched, the way Walter's cameras watched us. Something more fundamental. The sense that something very far away and very large had turned its attention in our direction, not with hostility, not with the mechanical detachment of an entity running a protocol, but with the specific quality of attention that you feel when you are seen accurately by something that understands what it is looking at. I have sat with this for 9 months. I have tried to account for it in ways that do not require me to believe what I think it means. I have considered that it was a subjective effect of the compound at peak exposure. I have considered that it was the brain's pattern recognition system, starved of its usual inputs, manufacturing a narrative to explain a sensation it had no other framework for. Both of those explanations are possible. I am a medic, not a physicist, and I do not have the instruments to adjudicate between them. What I can say is that the sensation was specific, and it was different from everything else the broadcast produced. Everything else that night came from inside: the grief, the anger, the homesickness, the pressure at the cracks. This was different. It came from a direction, from outside and far away and very large, and it lasted approximately 40 seconds, and then it was simply gone, and the broadcast continued as it had before. 40 seconds of being seen, clearly, accurately, by something that had, for years, been trying to make us invisible to each other. I do not know what to do with that. I have decided that not knowing what to do with it is the appropriate response, and that the alternative, filing it away as noise, treating it as a hallucination, writing it out of the record, would be a disservice to whatever happened in that room. I did not mention this in my inquiry testimony. I have mentioned it now because the record should be complete. I do not know what the architects are. I do not know why they did what they did to us during the adjustment period, whether it was strategic or incidental or something that does not translate into either of those categories. I do not know if the secondary broadcast was a test of the DTP protocol or a test of us, or whether that distinction means anything to an entity that operates outside the emotional geography that makes such distinctions feel important. What I know is this: 6 people sat in a room at 3:30 in the morning with their nervous systems open and their defenses dissolved, and the full weight of what had been done to them over 6 years pressing on every fracture and every wound, and they held on. Not heroically, not without cost, with the specific, ugly, unglamorous persistence of people who have decided what they will not surrender, and who are willing to say the hard, true thing out loud in order to keep it. If something was watching, it saw that. I hope it understood what it was seeing. I hope it filed that away in whatever it uses for memory, in whatever structure serves the purpose of a lesson learned. Because we are going to keep doing this. We are fractured and suspicious, and we carry our wounds like tools, and we are very good at using them against each other. We have been shaped by something that understood us well enough to know exactly where to press. We are not a species that heals cleanly or quickly or without argument. But we do not let go of what is real, even when we have been taught not to trust it, even when we are exhausted and frightened, and the tone is at full amplitude and the stations are lit in a pattern we have never seen before. We fight for the real thing with the stubbornness of creatures who have been told so many times that it doesn't exist that the telling has become its own proof that it does. I went home with Laurie on the last day of the trial. We drove through the city in the early morning, past the reconstruction scaffolding and the murals someone had painted on the orbital monitoring station walls, and the coffee shops that had opened early, because the city had learned not to wait for things to feel normal before it went ahead and lived. She took my hand on the highway. I held it. The relay stations caught the light, and we did not look at them. We drove home.